Hello everybody, today I'm going to be duping new makeup releases. As many of you already know, we've had, I would call it an overload of new makeup releases this year, and I have seen this video concept circulating around the internet, and I was inspired to do my own version of this. Basically, we're going to be shopping my stash for dupes for new makeup releases or potential alternatives. Something that I like to talk about on my channel very often is that you oftentimes don't necessarily need to buy the newest makeup item to stay on trend or to stay inspired or to achieve that sort of effect. Oftentimes you can find similar alternatives or very exact alternatives for new makeup releases in your own makeup collection, and this kind of concept is a great way for me to revisit my makeup collection through a different lens, and I think it's also a great video for you guys because you can stay inspired along with me. Alright, so the very first thing that I would like to talk about would be the new Tati Beauty Textured Neutrals Volume 1 palette. This is an eyeshadow palette that has been generating a lot of attention lately, and rightly so. Tati is a very visible influencer, and of course many people are interested in what she has to say with regards to makeup, and when you have her coming out with a new makeup brand and a new eyeshadow palette, naturally you're going to get a lot of conversation and hype and curiosity surrounding this palette as well. I admit when I first saw this palette I wasn't particularly interested because I saw a lot of neutrals, but today I watched her launch video and I was sucked in, to say the least, because so many of the shades are absolutely beautiful. She has a variety of different finishes in this palette. She has some glitter finishes, a lot of metallics, some mattes, and she has a lot of different color variety as well. You have the neutrals, but then you also have some purples. So when breaking down this palette and taking the different elements of it and trying to find alternatives for those elements in my collection, I came up with a few different products. So the very first item that I'm going to be sharing with you is, in my mind, a great alternative if you're only interested in, say, the neutrals in the Tati palette. So for an alternative, I would present this Morphe palette right here. This is the 39A palette, and I am presenting this as an alternative to the Tati palette because similarly to that palette, this has a lot of neutrals in here and you have a good gradient, and you do have like a hint of purple in this area as well. But similarly to the Tati palette, you have your neutrals and then you have your alternative just colors as well. However, in this palette you have a great deal more of mattes than you have metallic colors. So that is the only, well, that is one of the few differences that this palette has with the Tati palette, but I do think that this is a good alternative for the Tati palette. I do think that this color right here, specifically this beautiful purple shade, has a few similar characteristics to the matte purple shade that's present in the Tati palette as well. And I'm not saying that this is a direct dupe, but this is an alternative for the Tati palette. And it's nice to know that I already own this palette, so there's that. For somebody who is more interested in the colorful way of life, I would like to present this palette, the James Charles and Morphe palette, as a potential alternative for the Tati palette. Because you have so much color in here, I don't think that this palette just right off the bat looks like a good alternative for the Tati palette, but if you break this palette down and you start looking at it in sections, you do have your neutrals over here. You have like an entire gradient of colors over here that are pretty much neutrals. You have like your slight hints of purple. Yes, you have extra colors that are not similar to the Tati palette at all, but I do think that if you break this palette down, it has similar concepts. Tati's palette, from what I can gather, is supposed to be your perfect easy neutral palette for every day with like a few pops of color, and this palette is supposed to be an all-encompassing, good for any kind of look sort of palette. So those two purposes are kind of sort of aligned in that both palettes are supposed to cater towards a variety of different makeup looks. So in my mind, I look at this palette as having a great deal more color than the 39A version. This palette and the 39A palette, I see these two as being good alternatives. Are they exact dupes? No. but they're good alternatives. And that's what I want to say a lot of in this video because, see, here's the thing. In my mind, I think that a lot of times it's very difficult to dupe eyeshadow palettes precisely because unless you have somebody just copycatting a palette, you can't find exact color stories. But I do think that it's important to look at a palette objectively and just break down each and every different color. And once you start doing that, you can see, okay, this specific color, this specific shade is very similar to this palette, or this other part of the palette is similar to another palette. You know what I mean? So there are many different ways you can go about finding alternatives in your collection, but that's the way I'm doing it. I really like to break down color stories and see what palettes can correspond to what color stories I'm looking at. Next, I would like to talk about the Physicians Formula holiday palettes. They're coming out with these Muru Muru butter palettes, and they have a few different options, but I'm specifically for today going to focus on the 3-pan bronzer palette that they're coming out with. I personally love their bronzer, and that's why I'm presenting the Physicians Formula single Muru Muru butter bronzer, just the single pan, not the entire palette, as an alternative. Because, see, for me, and by the way, I'm wearing this bronzer on my face today. For me, I look at bronzer and many other different face products as being incredibly personal to skin tone, undertone, and just all of those things. So for me, whenever I look at a bronzer palette, I see that as being something that is really only gonna be benefiting somebody who's a makeup artist or just somebody who does makeup on a lot of other people. I personally, as many of you can relate to, am not somebody that is doing makeup on a lot of other people. On the contrary, I just do makeup for myself because I enjoy it and it's my hobby. But I see just a single bronzer as being a good alternative for a bronzer palette. So while Physicians Formula is launching their bronzer palette, I'm just going to stick to the classic Physicians Formula Muru Muru Butter Bronzer that I know and love and I'm obsessed with. Next, I want to talk about the Huda Beauty Mercury Retrograde Eyeshadow Palette. This is one that is absolutely beautiful. I saw this palette and I was like, pastels, different textures are present in this palette. It is so pretty, and yet there are some neutrals in here. And also I was like trying to think, is there any way I can find alternatives for this palette in my own collection? And I will say that it was hard because I think a lot of the colors in this palette are colors that I actually don't have good duplicates of, but I really wanted to see if I could come up with alternatives, and I did just that. So I have a lot of different alternatives. So the first palette that I want to mention would be a palette that I think corresponds to like the various turquoise and orangey and purple shades in the palette. And for that kind of alternative, I would present the Pinky Rose Bright Lights palette. Yes, this palette is super, super vivid, and the Huda Beauty one is very pastel tone. But if you really break this palette down, then you might notice that this color, this color, this color, this color, they match the vibes of the Huda Beauty Mercury Retrograde palette, and they are not exact dupes, but they are alternatives. Similarly to that, I would also like to mention the Juvia's Place Magic palette. If you look inside, you have like a pastel theme going on with a few of these shades, and I do think that this color story corresponds to the Mercury Retrograde palette. Is this an exact dupe? No, because the color story is slightly different. But a few of these shades, say the purple tones, the silvery tones, the pinkish tones, match the vibes of the Mercury Retrograde palette, which in my mind presents this palette as a good alternative, of course if you already own this palette. Lastly, I do want to talk about these products right here. Now, when I saw the Mercury Retrograde palette, I instantly thought of like pastel tones, but like a lot of different just like shiny finishes, and for me, that made me think of the Hard Candy Glitterazzi's. I have spoken about these a lot recently. Basically, these are dual-ended eyeshadow products. One end is supposed to be a liquid eyeshadow. The other end is supposed to be glitter suspended in a liquid formula. So essentially, these are both supposed to be companions, or rather eyeshadow toppers. So when I was thinking of the vibes of the Huda Beauty Mercury Retrograde palette, I found that these, just in my mind, matched those vibes almost precisely. Are these exact dupes? No, but if you're looking for something that is glittery, that is pastel, I think that these are good options in my mind. And the shades that I have are Cosmo Queens, which is like this pinky whitish one. I also have Supernova, which is like this green one. And then I have Earthy Vibes, which is this one right here. I have spoken about these in some recent videos that I did, most notably my, I think it was makeup under the radar makeup reviews. That's the video that I featured these in. So if you want to see swatches, if you want to see a more in-depth review and analysis on these products, that video is on my channel. But yeah, I feel like these three products are good alternatives for the Huda Beauty palette because they match the vibes of the palette. No, they're not exact dupes, but they match the vibes, and therefore I think that they provide good alternatives for that palette. So BH Cosmetics recently launched the Scorpio palette, which is just another part of their Zodiac palette series that we have been seeing, but I was looking at that palette and I was like, okay, so the color story of this palette is like very pinky, it's kind of mauvey, it's definitely very fall tone appropriate, and I came up with two possible palette alternatives for this BH Cosmetics palette, and in my mind, I think that these color stories are slightly better in my personal opinion, but I first would like to present to you the Anastasia Beverly Hills Modern Renaissance palette. And if you look at this palette right here, it has like that very visible pink kind of theme, and then it also has like that slightly mauve theme, and then you have like those metallics in here. So if you already own this palette, I think that this would be a fair alternative to the BH Cosmetics one. The BH Cosmetics palette is definitely a palette that I consider to be slightly more grungy and slightly more cooler tone than this one, but the two palettes are similar in their color stories, and therefore I think that this one is a viable alternative. Then the next palette I have to share with you is definitely one that I consider to be a more on the nose alternative for the BH Cosmetics palette, but this is slightly more, I would guess, under the radar. I wouldn't say that a lot of people talk about this palette when compared to the Anastasia Beverly Hills Modern Renaissance palette, but I will say I like this option a lot better. This is a Dose of Colors Blushing Berries palette. I love this palette so much. It's very good. The mattes are absolutely beautiful, and yes, this palette is consisted of exclusively 5 matte shades, and they're all berry tones, they're all fall appropriate, and in my mind they match the vibes of the BH Cosmetics Scorpio palette almost perfectly. So if I had to choose between the Modern Renaissance or the Blushing Berries palette as an alternative for the BH Cosmetics palette, I would definitely choose the Blushing Berries one. Yes, both of these palettes are more expensive than the BH Cosmetics palette. Right now, I'm shopping my stash, so I'm not necessarily thinking about pricing, but if I had to provide you with a budget-friendly alternative for the BH Cosmetics palette, I would say the ColourPop palettes would be a good bet because some of the ColourPop color stories are, in my mind, similar to the BH Cosmetics Scorpio palette. The next product I want to talk about would be the James Charles and Morphe Pressed Pigments Mini palette. I don't really care what the name is. I just care that this is a pressed pigments palette that is essentially the original pressed pigments palette, but a smaller packaging and with a mirror. Basically, that's the entire concept of the palette. It's supposed to be a travel-friendly palette. See, the thing is, in my opinion, I think that if you're looking at that palette and you're interested in getting it, a good alternative for that palette that you probably already own in your collection would be the Morphe and James Charles palette, the full size, you know, that I've been mentioning in this video already. But I'm just like, see, the thing is, my thing is with mini palettes, if you're getting a mini palette, in my mind, it should have like also a very curated color scheme. It should be more easier to digest. I'm looking at the mini James Charles and Morphe palette, and I'm seeing like just a palette that is exactly the same as this one, just shrunk. you know. And I think in my mind, if you already own the Morphe and James Charles palette, there's little to no reason for you to go and get the mini version unless you're like a big fan of James Charles, and in that case, do you, boo. I would also say, sorry, all these palettes are going on the floor. I know that's terrible, but I'm only like just like putting down the palettes that have like a harder pressed formula. Never fear. But another alternative for the Morphe and James Charles mini palette, if you don't necessarily own the Morphe and James Charles original palette, would be, hold up, the Color Drain Vivid Pigments and Shadows palette. Sorry, this chair is like very swivelly. It's fun, alright. But this is the Color Drain, I already said the name. Anyway, this has 16 shades in it, and it is essentially, in my mind, very similar to the vibes of the Morphe and James Charles palette, except that this palette is a lot more condensed and it doesn't have those neutrals. So, in my mind, if you're a colorful makeup lover and you want a ton of variety, if you want some gradients, then this is a great option. And I've constantly, like ever since I got these two palettes, ever since I got this palette and the Morphe James Charles Morphe palette, I've been comparing the two, and I actually did a video in which I duped the James Charles palette with this palette, and I really do think that in my mind, this formula is a lot better than the James Charles and Morphe palette because the colors seem to be a lot more saturated, they seem to be a lot more opaque in this one, and they're just a lot more user-friendly in my personal opinion, and I just like the vibrancy of these colors and I like the effect a lot more. So, if you're interested in getting the James Charles mini palette and you don't have the full-size palette, I would recommend this palette right here. I'm filming this on my phone because my camera stopped recording and the battery's dead, and I don't have time to recharge it because I have to go, but coincidentally, that pretty much completes my entire video. These are a few very popular, I'd say very hyped to varying degrees, makeup items that have been launched or have been announced recently, and I just think that duping them was a really great way for me to remind myself of how much makeup I have, and it's also a great way for you guys to just be inspired to shop your own stash when you see a new makeup product. Just see what kind of alternatives you can come up with in your own makeup collection, because everyone has a different makeup collection, so naturally we all have different alternatives for newer makeup products. But with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video and found it interesting. Thank you so much for staying with me throughout the duration of this video, and I will see you all tomorrow. Bye guys.